The first step in the fabrication of our occlusal rim on top of our base plate is to flow wax all inside the periphery here. If you notice, we left a little space between the ledge of the land area of the cast and the base plate itself, and this is done throughout. So we're going to flow some wax inside that space and make sure that you have your model rotated in a sense, and the wax, so you're going to have control of the flow of the wax so it doesn't run off too much, because if the wax flows excessively, it will cool off prematurely and it won't fill in the space correctly. So I'm going to start over here. So I will hold my model or tilt my model in a way that I will have control of the flow of the wax. And this wax can be very hot. Okay, the hotter the wax, the more flow you have. One thing I want to point out, that these models were soaked for about 5-10 minutes. Okay, in room temperature water. So there's no risk of the wax actually sticking to the cast. So I'll show you here on the side, because the whole model was soaked. So I'm going to heat up some wax with my number 7 spatula, and you can see it being very hot. If this model was dry, the wax will seep into the pores and adhere to the model. But because of the moisture barrier sitting on the model, I don't have the risk of that wax sticking to it. I can just peel it off quite nicely. Okay, so make sure you soak your models. Some people prefer to separate their models using separating fluid. I tend to like soaking them because it's a cleaner finish. So, and you see there how the wax wants to flow because I'm using a lot of heat. But just work on little sections at a time. I'm making sure that I'm holding the base plate firmly up against the model. And again, work in little sections. You could use the fond stock. Problem with that is you're going to pick up so much wax, you're going to have a very difficult time trying to control the flow of the wax. So I tend to use the number 7. You can certainly use the fond stock, but it's your call. And I'll work on little sections at a time. And don't forget to hold the base plate with one hand. Making sure nothing lifts off the cast. Some of the areas that you've relieved before, you might get wax flowing under the base plate, which is quite fine. Wax is going to overlap the edge of the land area or the land area itself, and that's okay too. We'll let that cool off, and then we'll move on to the next section. So as you can imagine, the lower pipe block is done in the same way. So controlling the flow of your wax and the consistency of your wax and having the right temperature to make sure that it fills in the space completely, and at the same time create a nice smooth transition between the wax and the edge of the base plate itself goes a long way. Now, because I took care of tapering this base plate right at the very back, I don't have to add wax past the edge of the base plate. But what you should do though is add a fine layer of wax over the whole thing. And I mean very fine. Less than 1/2 millimeter, if we could measure that. So that way, the feel of the base plate will mimic somewhat the finished product when it's nice and smooth. So we're building patient confidence. The bite block is going to feel somewhat of their existing denture if they have one, or at least be comfortable if they don't have one. And this makes it a whole lot easier when I introduce the occlusal rim to what I've applied now for everything to bond together or to stick together. So just a fine layer over the whole thing. And of course I'm going to take my alcohol torch and smooth everything out. Careful not to drip too much wax inside the palate because it'll make it very bulky and restrict the tongue space and make it uncomfortable for the patient. We want to mimic the finished product in terms of the upper or the lower as much as possible to ensure that patient has adequate space to go through the motions of maxillomandibular relations. And actually goes through the right motions. If we make it too big, they're not going to be able to execute some of the positions that we're going to ask them to do. Or if we make it too small, it's got to be very close to what they once had. So I'm going to smooth this out with my alcohol torch. I don't have the risk of distorting the base plate. This is a fairly stable base plate, and I'm not putting a lot of heat on it. I'm holding it fairly close, and basically I'm just smoothing out the wax. So I'm going to move to the lower, and I'll do the same thing to the lower. So once again, I've soaked the model. This is very similar. The only difference is we're going to add some on the lingual. Now in the area where you had relieved before, because of the undercut here, try to flow the wax in there as much as you can. So I'll start on that side. Make sure everything is nice and clean. I had some pencil marks here from before. I'm pinching everything down, so I'm clamping the base plate down with my fingers so it doesn't lift. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose of creating a stable base plate if you happen to get wax underneath and the base plate lifts. So again, work in little sections at a time until I get some sufficient wax on there. I'm going to make a conscious effort of holding the base plate to the cast as much as I can to make sure that it doesn't lift off the cast as the wax cools off. And right in here, I'm going to heat up the wax just a little bit more and get it to flow under the base plate if I could, to engage that undercut in wax this time. I'll finish off on the facial aspect here. And of course you want to apply a fine film of wax over the whole base plate once you finish the periphery. So I think the key here is to have control of the flow of the wax to ensure that you don't have excess flow. You want flow, but you don't want excess flow. Because if you do, the wax is gonna cool off too early, and it won't get inside all the little spaces that you need to fill in. And you're not gonna have a nice blending between the wax and the base plate itself. Now I'm gonna purposely overlap the land area with wax here. So I'm gonna overbuild it a little bit, which is fine. But then I'm gonna go back and trim it back somewhat to give me a better idea of the overall shape of the bite block. So I'm not gonna have all this excess wax that you see now over the land area while I'm putting on the occlusal rim. I'm gonna cut it back a little bit. But before I do that, I'm gonna flow some wax over the whole thing. And smooth everything out with my alcohol torch. So you can see the wax overlapping the land area, which is quite fine. So while this is cooling off, I'll go back to the upper and I'll take the back of my number 7 spatula and clean off the wax that overlapped over the land area to give me a better sense of the overall size of the bite block. If you can't see it, what you can also do, you can take it off the model and trim it back a little bit. But I think in most cases, you can definitely have a good sense of the edge of the land area and where and how wide this bite block needs to be. So this, I think, paints a better picture in my mind where I need to put my occlusal rim. Okay? I'm going to pry this off just to show you something. Obviously, the wax comes off rather easily because I did soak the model for quite some time, about 5-10 minutes or so. Careful not to distort the wax, so there's no residue of wax left on the cast. And here I have a bit of a flash of wax here, but I can certainly go back and trim that back a little bit. Just scrape that off with my fond stock. And of course, I still need to do my frenal relief. I'll do that at the very end. So if you have trouble seeing where to cut it back, you can take it off and maybe cut it back off the cast to make sure that you don't make it too bulky now, because that's going to throw off where you put your occlusal rim, and it's got to be an ideal situation. So I'll just feather that in all the way around. If you are going to melt some wax off the cast, make sure you don't get any wax on the underside of the base plate. Okay. Now, before I put it back on my master cast, I just want to outline the crest of the ridge. If you recall, bone resorption on the maxilla happens in upwards in a palatal direction, so therefore the lingual edge of the occlusal rim is going to sit over the crest of the ridge all the way around. And as you'll see later on, when I start adapting the wax to start shaping my occlusal rim, it's the inner edge or the lingual edge that's going to be positioned over this line here. So another line that we can utilize, if you have a hard time seeing it, we can certainly outline our mid-palatal suture. And this starts painting a sense of symmetry. Here's our midline. They don't always line up with the labial frenums, so I'm going to go here. But we're already starting to create some kind of equal distance now from one side to the midline and to the other side. So I'm trying to think symmetry now. Okay, and I think these lines will help you create that when you start shaping your occlusal rim. I'll put this back on here, make sure it's all the way down, nothing has lifted, and that's good. And now I'll return to the lower because this has cooled off somewhat. And I can certainly use the back of my number 7 spatula or any other instrument that you feel comfortable with and scrape off the excess off the land area. The land area is not part of the tissue bearing surface of the final product, so if you end up scraping it a little bit, it's quite okay. So I'm going to scrape off the excess to have a better idea in terms of symmetry and overall shape and size when I start shaping my occlusal rim on top of the base or base plate. I'm not overly concerned right now with the frenal relief. I can do that all together in the end because, as you'll see, once I start adapting the rest of the wax, if I were to relieve them now, I would probably end up filling them again, so I'm doing double the work. So I'll just leave that for the end. Just going to blow off a little bit of the excess, and one more time, just smooth everything out, get everything nice and smooth for the occlusal rim.